Welcome. I'm Bob Booth, Director of the Manchester Historical Museum, and we're in Manchester by the Sea, a small seaside town in Essex County, standing on the Common, a traditional New England common, with, in this case, the town hall and the firehouse, and this beautiful church from 1809. It is the third of the meeting houses of the post-Puritans of Manchester, Massachusetts. Here we are across the street, and we're standing in front of the earliest part of a house built in 1823. This is the house that is now the headquarters of the Manchester Historical Museum. Remarkably, it was built for a single woman, Abigail Hooper. Abigail, who was known as Nabby as a girl, was a native of this town, born in 1788. Her father died when she was 6 years old. She had 3 brothers, and then she had step-siblings. And when she turned 13 and was ready to be placed in domestic service, like all the other girls of that time, they were not intended for careers. They were intended to learn how to do domestic work while they waited for somebody to marry them when they turned 20. Nabby refused to go into domestic service. She demanded that she be placed in a real job somewhere. So from the beginning, we know that she was a very strong-willed person, and she had the support of her family. So from Manchester, she was placed in Gloucester at a dry goods store. Had the chance for 7 years to observe how a business was run. She also mastered the craft of making bonnets, which turned her into a milliner. But she wasn't just a milliner working for someone else. When she turned 20, she returned to Manchester, and we know that she opened a millinery shop. In the deeds, she is not referred to as a single woman like all other unmarried women. She is referred to as a milliner. So she had already built a business at the age of 20 or 21. And we know, because we have her account ledgers, that the first thing she did after establishing her store here in Manchester was to add a liquor store to the original bonnet shop. So although it wasn't consistent, it was money-making. And over the next few years, Abigail, Nabby Hooper, had no interest in marriage, no interest in the domestic arts, as we know from the tiny kitchen that she actually put onto the house here. Her interest was in business, and it is likely that she put several men out of their own businesses as she expanded her store into a small department store. It went from being a bonnet shop with a liquor store to becoming a fabric store as well as a grocery store. So she pretty much created a very tiny retail empire in downtown Manchester. She became the wealthiest person in the town, highly influential, and important, not married. So when she turned 35 years old, she decided to stay in this town and build a house for herself. This is the only house that we know of, probably in all of Massachusetts, that was built by a woman for herself, not using the money of men. So when she built it, she would have had 3 or 4 girls working the counters for her, and they, as apprentices were in those days, they would have been considered members of her family. So she would have lived here with 3 or 4 girls. It was her dwelling house, it was not her store. And in this epical year for her of 1823, where she builds the house, there is another person in this town, the richest of the town's shipmasters. Now, this town had no commerce of its own because it really had no harbor, but many of the boys were raised to be expert seafaring men and sailed out of Salem and Boston. One of those, the most successful, was a boy named Richard Tink, who became a very prosperous shipmaster, sailing out of Boston but living here in Manchester. Early in 1823, his wife died, leaving 2 kids, ages 9 and 12. And we know that happened in April. This house was finished by August, And by November, Richard and Abigail were married. But they weren't married in the usual sense of a marriage in those days, where the wife becomes totally dependent on the husband. Abigail had arranged for a prenuptial agreement that was entirely in her favor. So she was a businesswoman in all relations of life. And it would appear that Richard Tink was perfectly happy to have such a partner. She took on his two children, and in the following year, 1824, they had their own child, a son, Charles. And within a year after that, Richard Tink, who was almost always at sea in trade with Russia, probably found out on his way coming back to Boston from one of these trips that Abigail had changed his name from Tink to Trask, which she preferred. So Abigail was a force to be reckoned with by everyone she encountered. So now we're visiting with Abigail Hooper herself. This is a portrait of Nabby Hooper that was painted sometime around 1823 when she built this house. It is so untypical of the portraits of women at that time, but of course Nabby herself was so untypical. So as we look at her looking back at us with that stern retailer's business entrepreneur's gaze, she is staring through spectacles. We see her holding a quill pen as she's working in an account ledger. She is the best advertisement for one of her own bonnets, and she is wearing a mourning pin at the as a neck piece here. So we also see maybe the only portrait of a woman in New England who is also wearing a watch as part of her daily garb. So this is a very hard-nosed businesswoman. She is not here to impress you with her feminine qualities. She is here to get you to buy her rum at a premium. So as we walk along this long building, this is now the home of the Manchester Historical Museum. This second half of the building was added as these children appeared in Abigail's life. She added the second half of the building in 1829 and had actually very small grounds, but we know that she kept a garden of at least of dahlias because she writes about that. And now we are entering the grounds of this house, which we are interpreting these days on the outside primarily in terms of the salt cod fishery, which was the most important business in Massachusetts for 200 years. But here in the back of the building, we have interpreted through artifacts and reproductions the corner of a typical New England fish yard. So beginning in the 17th century, the primary export of New England was two things. It was lumber and it was salt codfish. And over time, the salt codfish became the most important part of the Massachusetts participation in the overall imperial trade of Britain. So one of the things we're also doing today is interpreting the history of this town at the very end of that period of this town being part of a British possession. We're looking at it 250 years ago in 1772, and we'll be talking about the fish yard, the importance of fishing, largely in terms of how that related to the very end of colonial commerce before the United States began. And as we start out in looking at the elements of a fish yard, we have to start by looking at the elements of catching these fish in the first place. So it really begins in a town like Manchester or any of the other fishing ports. And Marblehead was the largest, with the best reputation for the quality of its fish, but virtually every coastal town in New England had, to some extent, participation in the salt cod fishery. But here it begins with salt. It begins with salt from Spain. This is coarse Spanish salt, And there would be whole warehouses of this salt in these seafaring towns. And these schooners that would go out to sea from these towns were often much smaller than you might think. Here in Manchester, we know that the largest of the schooners in the 18th century carried no more than 40 tons burthen, whereas trading vessels sailing out of Boston by that period might be carrying 250 tons of goods. So these are small schooners. Marblehead, you might find 50 to 70 tons that they were capable of carrying. But for important reasons, Manchester, which remained a very small town, also had small vessels. So as we take a look here at the illustration, these men would fill up a schooner, and this is a somewhat larger schooner than typically left Manchester, as I say. Let's think of a Manchester schooner as capable of carrying 40 tons of stuff. So as a crew would leave this town, what would be laden on board would be perhaps 20 tons of salt in barrels. And then there would be tons more of biscuit, flour, and meat, beef, because at sea, most of the men wanted to eat beef, not fish, and they never ate codfish. So out they would go from the little town of Manchester out to the banks off the southeast coast of Nova Scotia. So they're 900 miles out to sea. They're usually sailing in company, meaning they will leave Manchester with 3 or 4 schooners sailing at the same time. They're going to sail out twice a year. So let's look at spring fair. Usually they would leave in March with the expectation of staying on the fishing grounds into August. Once they arrived on the fishing grounds, it was a constant, endless routine of catching very, very large codfish, and they worked night and day. So there were night shifts as well as day shifts, even though it's only 5 to 6 men and a boy. So every one of these schooners took off with a boy on board to teach him the ropes of becoming a fisherman. And that kid was given a very hard time. He would, for one thing, have to become the cook on board. So every single night there was an opportunity to disapprove of the fare that they were eating. At any rate, a lot of these boys did go on to become fishermen. In those days, the options in a town like Manchester were not great. So if your parents were poor, as almost everyone in Manchester was, it was a working class town. There were no merchants, there were no ships, there were only a couple of wharves. If your parents were poor, you might be apprenticed into the fishery. If you, for some reason, if you had an aversion to that, maybe a bad experience on your first trip, you might be apprenticed into a craft like blacksmith or shoemaker. A few of the boys who were more fortunate would be apprenticed into Salem or Marblehead to learn how to be merchant mariners. So they'd go out as cabin boys on trading vessels. But the usual routine here in Manchester for a typical family was to send its sons at the age of 13 out to sea on one of these fishing schooners or out on one of the schooners of Gloucester or Marblehead. When they got out there, these men would fish 2 drop lines at a time with both hands. There are multiple hooks. They are constantly baited and rebaited, and they are pulling in all day long codfish that weighed between 80 and 120 pounds apiece. So these men are jacked. They are hugely muscular fellows, and they spend at least 3 months, sometimes 4 months, every single day of their lives with Sundays off, pulling in these heavy fish in a continuous round of catching and cleaning. So let's take a look at what happens when the fish comes aboard one of these schooners. This is a rather specialized business. So as the cod, you can see the size of the cod here is small because this is an illustration from a later time. But in the 1700s, the cod were enormous. So these men are cleaning the cod. one man is actually gutting the cod, and then he is saving the cod livers into this basket because cod liver oil is going to become an important byproduct of all of this. This man is taking out the head of the codfish, and this man is called the splitter. He's taking out the spine. So at the time that this little process is done, you'll end up with what is called a fillet. And this is a reproduction of a typical codfish fillet from the time. If anything, it's a little small. These fish, as I say, weighed up to 120 pounds. So this is what they would look like when put out to cure. And for those of you who've forgotten what a cod looks like, I brought along a codfish. So today, this is about the largest size you would get for a cod. Some people know cod these days as scrod at a restaurant. They are heavily, heavily fished, and they never get any bigger than this anymore. Back in the day I'm talking about, the fish here would be 6 or 7 times larger, typically coming over the rail of these schooners. The cod were bottom feeders. They had a typical little beard here, which is very distinctive to the codfish. And most important, they had extraordinary flesh that would uniquely make a codfish, if cured properly, and we'll talk about what that means. If cured properly, it becomes the only high protein food in the world that can be transported large distances without spoiling. So, second illustration here is actually an old lithograph of the Codfish Center here in Manchester as it looked in the early 19th century. We have 2 types of schooner that are parked here just offshore. This is a fish yard running up from what is a boardwalk wharf. You can see it. This is a tobacco boat, a pinky stern. This is a lightweight type of schooner that was fast and small. And then a heavier schooner called a heel topper, which had greater carrying capacity but was certainly quite a tub in terms of its sailing qualities. At any rate, whether you were in a tobacco boat schooner or a heel topper, you would hope you would get home. And let's talk about that for a moment, because these men out at sea off the coast of Nova Scotia, 900 miles away from home, are also, in many instances, hundreds of miles from the shore. They have no communication. They are usually in a fog bank while they're doing this. They have very little idea of what weather is about to hit them. So they're also in a shipping lane where very large vessels coming in from England are coming through the Grand Bank down along the shore here, off the coast of Nova Scotia towards Boston. And that means that often these little fishing boats in the fog are run down by larger vessels. So the death rate for fishing, and indeed even for smaller vessels engaged in merchant trade, is what we would consider appalling. The death rate was much higher than any war we've ever fought. And it would appear to be somewhere between 10 and 12% of all these fishermen and mariners in a town like Manchester would die every year. So the problem of growth in a town like this is not so much that people don't want to live here. It's that as people grow up in the maritime trades, so many of the young men die, and die in many cases before they marry, or more often soon after they've married, leaving young widows and children and no surplus of men to marry them. So this becomes a huge problem in trying to run a town based on a maritime economy, fishing, which is at best a subsistence business in which you lose a significant percentage of the men who do this thing every year. So I don't want to leave that out, that this is not just a business. This is a business that is highly personal to the people who do it. These men going out to sea with each other twice a year for 4 months at a time, often in the spring fair and the fall fair, are spending more time close together than any other working group in New England at the time. They have to rely on each other, they have to know each other extremely well, and it does become part of the culture of the town that this town has, almost everyone is related, and everyone has to spend, the men at any rate, have to spend a great deal of time with each other, keeping company and growing to rely on each other and care about each other a lot in a very hazardous business. So the schooners have returned, and it's important to understand that even though Manchester schooners are relatively small, they're not small in terms of everything else in Manchester. 40 tons of salt fish is coming back in the largest of the schooners, and 30 tons in the smaller schooners. That's still 30 tons of fish. So what's happened with that Spanish salt when they're at sea is that every night, as the catch is deposited down into the hold, there's a man down there called the salter. And his business is to take these fillets, these opened up triangular pieces of fish, and to pave them over with salt every day. Salt is the preservative. There is no refrigeration in those days, and these men are out at sea for 3 to 4 months. How do you keep the codfish from spoiling? Salt will do it, and that's why they sail away with 20 tons of salt in the hold. Their hope is that they will wet their salt. That's what it was called. When they finally did the last paving of salt, they could go home. So if they had a good voyage, they're coming home, and they arrive back in Manchester, and now they are sitting in the shallows about to unload 30 or 40 tons of codfish. This is a whole different process from the catching of fish. So as we look at the salt cod fishery of Massachusetts, it consists of 2 parts in any one of these fishing towns. And the first is the men who are still strong enough and able enough to go fishing and lift cod weights 8 months of the year. And then there's a whole different class of people who work in the fish yards to prepare this fish so that it can become the thing that the rest of the world values. Those people, and by the way, this is always men and boys. There are no women involved in any aspect of this business. So the men of what we call the fish yard, generally speaking, are men who survived their years at sea but no longer have the strength to work on board the fishing boats. Or it's little kids. It's kids younger than the age of 13, too young to apprentice, but often available to run around and do work. So these fish yards are owned by the top dogs in the local economy. This would be a trade called shoremen. The shoremen, and there are only a few of them here in Manchester, owned the land on which the fish yard was developed, usually owned the fishing schooners as well, and was the person who did the majority of the supplying of the food and drink for the men when they were at sea. And I should mention that just as on the land, the experience of men at sea was deeply informed by the imbibing of rum. There weren't a whole lot of choices. People didn't drink water much in those days. Orange juice, no. Soda pop, no. Coffee, not much in the 1770s, but plenty of rum. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But it was a highly alcoholic culture, whether you were at sea or at home here in a fish yard. And before I move on to interpret that, I do want to remind us that this business that I'm describing was the most important business to the Massachusetts economy of everything else that was going on. And so in 1795, when the State House is built in Boston, in the chamber of the House of Representatives what goes up. It is a 5-foot model of a codfish, the so-called sacred cod. One of the great relics of a business that has very few relics left. And I would like to say that in terms of what you're looking at here, a couple of different types of fish flake, reproduction here of codfish fillet, a washout tub, a hand barrow, and a half barrel of Spanish salt. This is all there is in Massachusetts to interpret this, this incredible business that went on for 200 years and kept the seafaring economy alive, whether it was the merchants making the big money or the individual fishing families. This was the most important thing that was done in Massachusetts, and it has been reduced to our little corner here behind the Manchester Historical Museum, but here it is. Okay, you land your codfish in the shallows. Here's the schooner. 40 tons of fish is coming up out of the hold. Most of it has been preserved by the salt. It's laden into dories that are waiting, and the dories pull into the shallows. And in the shallows, as tons and tons and tons of fish are coming in, the dories are met by these rather small horse-drawn wagons. And these wagons have only about a capacity for, say, 300 pounds of this fish. So tons and tons of fish is coming ashore by the hundreds of pounds. And the reason for this is that these wagons, as they come up into the fish yard, have to do a very important thing before the fish ends up out here on what we call fish flakes. And that is, as you might see in this lithograph of a Marblehead fish yard, there is a big tub. And that tub is exactly what you're looking at here, except this is the real deal. This is an actual washout tub from an actual fish yard from a couple of hundred years ago. And the process is, as this highly pickled salt fish is coming ashore in this wagon of maybe 300 pounds capacity, this washout tub will have been filled up with fresh water. And the fish are dumped out of the cart into the fresh water, and it washes out most of the salt that these fish have been paved with, some of them for 3 to 4 months at a time. This is critical to the process because the next thing that's going to happen when the fish go up onto the flakes is for the next 3 weeks, they will be cured in the sun and the wind. And if they had too much salt content, they would just burn. If they have too little salt content, they will rot. So you have to find the right chemical balance. And the critical aspect of getting that salt out of a fish that's been sitting in salt for 3.5 months is this big tub of fresh water. But not to say that this isn't another aspect of life in the 1770s in a fish yard. Almost everything required special kinds of work done by various kinds of people. It was all segmented into little parts of a business involving dozens of tons of curing at any given time. So there's no hoses or running water in those days. Here's a big tub. It's going to have 300 pounds of fish being dumped into it all day long out of the many tons that are coming ashore. And every time that 300 pounds of salt fish is dumped into this fresh water, it has to be drained and start all over again. So it means that we need big barrels of fresh water being sourced from ponds and springs that are rolled or carried or carted into the fish yard. And then once the barrels are here, this is where you put some of those little kids to work. And they have buckets, and they will, as this is drained, they will fill it up all over again, bucket by bucket by bucket, from these big water barrels. That's just one tiny corner of the work that goes on in the fish yard. many, many hands to do almost anything that goes on. So, once the fresh water has taken the salt out of the fish, we go to the hand barrow, and this is what you might think of as a wheelbarrow without a wheel. It's a two-man barrow. This too is authentic to a fish yard. It's an antique relic. Wheelbarrows, generally speaking, weren't used, although you can see them sometimes, including in that illustration, because the fish yard was so muddy and the wheel would go into the mud. So typically, you and another fella are standing next to the washout tub. Somebody else is going to pile 200 or 300 pounds of washed out salt cod onto your hand barrow, and then you will book it up into the fish yard and put it onto something called a cod horse. And that is a big pile, a little mountain of codfish that have been washed out and need to sit there for a day as the liquid drains out of them. Once that's happened, the cod is ready to be taken up onto the flakes. So we have a couple of different types of flake here. This is the more typical type of flake, pretty primitive, made out of scantlings, small sapling trees cut down, and this is what you would see all down the coast from Maine to Cape Cod. However, and this is a pretty good scale for a reproduction of a fillet. So you can see you have to build a lot of flakes in order to cure tons of this fish. And what's the goal here? Well, we're taking a rather thick body of this guy times 5 or 6. He's been opened up. It's still pretty fleshy. When it arrives, it's just been salted. It hasn't dried out. So the goal of the cure on the fish flakes is to take that fleshy, meaty fish and desiccate it, dehydrate it in a process that involves a little more salt, but really involves the right amounts of wind and sun over time. And if the cure is done properly over the course of 3 weeks, you will end up with the only serious fast food in the 18th century world, which is a salt codfish. The cures didn't always go perfectly. No one could control the weather. We have a foggy day today. What we want was a sunny, breezy day for perfect curing, but we'll take it because it's not raining. If it were raining, the men would be out here with old blown out canvas, former sails on vessels, and be covering all of the fish, covering tons, acres of these fish flakes, covering it up to protect it from the rain. They're also protecting it every day from seagulls, from varmints like rats, raccoons, and other critters. And it is pretty much a never-ending war against the elements once this stuff is up in the fish yards. So even on a great day, a great sunny, breezy day, the men are walking through the fish yards, flipping over the fish almost every hour so that they can get equal exposure to sun and wind. And this is what it takes, constant attention by many, many hands in order to get a good cure. It wasn't an easy thing to do. As I say, Marblehead was the place that earned the reputation as having the very best fish in the market, and that's not a coincidence. Men worked very, very, very hard to get it just right, and were working for shipping merchants who insisted that most of what was brought home had to be good enough to get top dollar when it went overseas. Okay, so the idea is, let's take a large fleshy piece of fish and dehydrate it, desiccate it down into a thin piece of fish that is pretty much stiff as a board. I can demonstrate this a bit in that I have 2 pieces of salt cod that came down from Nova Scotia, and I've been curing them here on this fish flake. So they're getting there. This started out as a bendy guy that was pretty fleshy, and as you can see, he's pretty much stiff now. Also quite small, but what can I do about that? Eventually, this piece of fish will begin to, and is right now, resembling what these larger fillets were. You can see how thin it is compared to the fish that came over the reel, and it's quite stiff. It's not stiff as a board yet, but it's getting there. So as we look at this process, this flake is the typical flake that you find throughout New England. This flake, which as you can see is a much higher tech piece of construction, is a Marblehead flake. And a big difference, at least by the 19th century in Marblehead, is that they had gone from building a table-like structure with 4 legs to a tiltable structure on 2, which meant that during the course of a day, as the arc of the sun went over the fish yard, they were able to tilt the top of their flake to get maximum exposure to the sun, which is a pretty good indication of just how committed the Marbleheaders were to getting a great cure on the fish. All right, so what are the financial consequences of this incredible business? And I should say, for the fishermen, it was never anything more than a subsistence business. In fact, you very infrequently do you find, even in a place like Marblehead, certainly in a place like Manchester, a brand new house being built for a fisherman. They just didn't make that much money. It wasn't, the whole business was designed to make a few people rich and to keep the rest of the people working. So if you were a typical fisherman, you are not hired to go out to sea. You are going out on shares. So you have a friend who's a skipper, and he is going to put together the crew, and you will agree that you will provide a certain percentage of the provisions for your long voyage, and you will agree that you're going to be paid not on wages, but on a share of the profits. So that every man on board is highly motivated to catch as much fish as possible and to salt them down and make sure that as much good fish gets home as they can possibly land. So in the subsistence business, the great mass of those who did the work, the fishermen, were paid not on wages but on shares. And this is a risk that these men are taking. So everyone is pulling together as hard as they can when they're at sea to land as many fish and to make sure that as many fish as possible are preserved to get home. When they do get home, the men are waiting for the shoremen to finish the cure of these fish and to sell them to a merchant. So until this fish is sold, these men are not paid. And when the sale is made to shipping merchants, and we'll talk about that a little bit, only then do the men even know whether the voyage has been profitable. So it is possible, and did happen occasionally, that men would spend 3.5 months at sea, and if it was not a good voyage, they would come home with no money at all as the proceeds of all of their work. Okay, so the top dogs in this business are the shipping merchants. And these men are the men who live in grand houses on main streets in seaports like Marblehead, a few of them in Gloucester, Salem, Boston. These men send out agents into the fish yards of Manchester for most of the months of the year, other than the winter time when this work isn't being done. And the agent will go through the fish yards and pick out the kind of fish that the merchant wants to ship. That is not always the very highest quality. The merchant has 2 real choices in doing transatlantic business. And the first is trade with Spain and Portugal. And That is done on the basis of the very highest quality cure of fish called merchantable. And this is the kind of fish that will arrive in Bilbao or Lisbon with the merchants of Spain and Portugal looking for the very best type of salt codfish. Not only is the seaport cuisine of the Iberian countries based on salt cod, mainly on salt cod from New England, bacalao and many other variations on food, but in Bilbao, for example, there are caravans standing by in the highlands above the seaport, waiting to load up on hundreds of tons of this salt codfish and trundle their way across the highlands of Spain, through France, all the way to northern Italy. So there's a vast economic enterprise is counting on hundreds of tons of this fish coming out of Massachusetts. And the cuisine of the Catholic countries, where people are required to eat fish at least once a week, becomes largely based on the fish coming out of Manchester. That fish, if it has the best possible selling qualities, the merchantable codfish, will be traded for Spanish wine, Spanish salt, fruit that we don't have, oranges, lemons, limes, and maybe most important, it will be traded for gold and silver. So a lot of the currency here in colonial Massachusetts is based on Spanish gold and Spanish silver coming out of the mines of South America. And how do you think it ever got here? It got here through an exchange for salt codfish. So that's the high-end trade. But the largest volume trade for a shipping merchant who owns a vessel or two or three, or in some cases 15 or 16, these are freighters. And these often are ranging between 200 and 300 tons burthen. So they're able to buy up 5 schooners worth of salt codfish and transport it into the markets. The secondary market, which is actually the largest in terms of volume, is the Caribbean. So there is a grade of fish where if the cure doesn't go perfectly well, and it usually didn't because of weather, so you might have spots where the fish burnt or little spots of rot in the fish. It's still good, it's still transportable, and it's still going to become food somewhere. So this second quality food, codfish is called refuse cod, and it's going to go down to the Caribbean, and there it will be traded to the sugar planters who have this eternal summer going on of planting, harvesting, and processing sugar cane. This is where the great majority of the slave trade comes from. These sugar planters have, in the mid-1600s, have imported enslaved people from Africa by the hundreds of thousands to come and work down on these plantations. And these people are fed primarily, 90% of their diet is salt codfish from New England, the second grade codfish. And so this salt cod, which is absolutely essential to the workings of these plantations based on enslaved workers to produce sugar and molasses. The entire population of Europe has a sweet tooth that can only be satisfied by the sugar of the Caribbean. But here in New England, we have a different appetite, as does most of the world, and that is for the stuff that molasses can turn into. So these shipping merchants from Marblehead, Salem, and Boston are exchanging fillets of fish for huge barrels of sugar, but more important, huge barrels of black, thick, liquid molasses. And at the time we're talking about, in the 1770s, when these vessels come back, large vessels worth of molasses and sugar, that molasses will be offloaded onto the wharves of a place like Marblehead and Salem and will be rolled directly into the rum distilleries. So one has to imagine these colonial seaports as having, in Salem, for example, we know that there were 6 or 7 distilleries by 1772. So when we come ashore into one of these seaports, when we come into their harbors, the most notable structures in the town aren't the churches. They are these very large rum distilleries. That rum, which as I mentioned is sort of the staple drink of all of New England and most of the British Atlantic world, that rum will become the most valuable stock in trade for the merchants. Essentially, what the shipping merchants have been able to do is take a fillet of fish and turn it into a case of rum, and there's your profit margin. In the 1830s, improbably, Manchester became one of the leading centers of furniture manufacture in the United States of America, and it's all attributable to the kind of furniture you're looking at here, which is high-end, apparently mahogany, and is sold into the market at a place just under walnut, cherry, and real mahogany. For this is not actually mahogany, this is mahogany veneer. These are very, very thin strips of real mahogany that have been applied over pine drawers and pine tops to appear as if it's mahogany, but it is not. So it finds a high niche in the overall marketplace just under the very high-priced types of wood. No one knows that it is mahogany veneer, and people are willing to pay a good deal of money for this kind of furniture. The reason that Manchester becomes successful at this is that the man who invented the high output power mahogany veneer multi-bladed saw was a cabinet maker here in Manchester, John Perry Allen. So as we look at this beautiful, beautiful furniture, we're looking at a turning point in American manufacturing that is entirely the product out of the brain of one man from this little town. So welcome to the harbor of Manchester by the sea. In the old days, this harbor didn't exist. Manchester was by the sea, but had no harbor of its own. So what you're looking at today, this beautiful piece of salt water, which accommodates everything from luxury yachts to fishing and lobster boats, is a product of the very wealthy in the 1890s who wished to have their own playground here in Manchester, and amongst other things, they dredged out what was once just a great big old salt marsh and mud bank, turned it into this beautiful harbor, but they weren't done. They also created the beautiful Essex County Club, one of the handsomest country clubs in the Northeast, as well as the Manchester Yacht Club. And in general, they had created for themselves such a beautiful summertime place that by World War I, there were 20 foreign embassies here in Manchester by the Sea, all partaking of this natural beauty and a sophisticated cosmopolitan society.